Chapter 29 Of Stories of Old Greece and Rome by Emilie Kipp Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29 The Caledonian Hunt. One of the heroes of the Argonautic expedition was Meleager, son of Æneas and Althæa, king and queen of Calydon. When Meleager was born, his mother saw in a vision the three Fates spinning the thread of her child's life, and she heard them foretell that he would live until the brand then burning on the hearth should be consumed. Althæa, terrified by the vision, awoke, and snatching the brand from the fire she plunged it into an earthen jar full of water. When she saw that the last spark was extinguished, she carefully hid the brand on whose existence depended the life of her son. Meleager, thus saved from death, grew up into splendid and vigorous manhood, and was welcomed by Jason as a fitting companion for the famous voyage to Colchis. While his son was absent on this expedition, Æneas offended Diana by omitting to offer to her the customary yearly sacrifice, so the angry goddess sent a fierce boar to devastate the country. This creature was of such enormous size and strength that no hunters dared attack it, and it laid waste the fields of Calydon by trampling on the young corn, rooting up vines and olive trees, and devouring flocks and herds, thus creating wild confusion among the panic-stricken people. When Meleager returned from his voyage and learned of the disaster that had overtaken the land, he summoned a band of heroes and set out to slaughter the wild boar. Jason, Nestor, Telamon, the father of Ajax, Theseus and his friend Pirithous, Peleus, afterwards the father of Achilles, the twin brothers Castor and Pollux on their snow-white horses, all these and many others came at Meleager's call to join in the hunt. With the youths also came Atalanta, daughter of Jasius, king of Arcadia. This princess had been left with an infant on Mount Parthenium and exposed to the hunger of wild beasts, for her father was angry at finding that the gods had sent him a daughter instead of the longed-for son. Atalanta was not devoured, however, nor did she perish from cold, for a kindly she-bear nursed the deserted infant, and she grew up strong and fearless. Later on some shepherds found the sturdy little maiden in the woods, and taking her to their rude home they cared for her and taught her to follow the chase. Thus she had grown up like a boy, fearless, bold, and skilled beyond most youths in the use of bow and spear. When the company of heroes saw Atalanta ready to join them in the chase for the wild boar, they were disposed to scoff at the idea of a maiden taking part in an adventure whose dangers might make a brave man fearful. But Meleager, won by Atalanta's beauty, welcomed her eagerly and begged her to share in the hunt. Then the company set forth into the forest, and they did not have to wait long for their quarry, for as soon as the wild boar heard the barking of the dogs and the sound of snorting steeds, he rushed out of his lair and savagely attacked the hunters. One after another of the heroes was gored by the boar's long tusks, or thrown down and trampled on by the cruel hoofs, or put to flight. Jason threw his spear, but it only grazed the boar's side. Telamon rushed forward, but stumbled over a projecting root and fell to the ground. Nestor, thrown headlong by a furious attack from the boar, sought safety in the branches of a tree. Theseus hurled his lance, but it was caught by a bough and turned aside. Then an arrow from Atalanta's bow pierced the brute's side, and blood flowed from the wound. The infuriated boar turned savagely upon her, but Meleager, who was ever near the maiden, hurled his spear with so true an aim that the boar fell dead upon the bloody and trampled ground. Then the heroes crowded around Meleager, congratulating him on his victory, but he refused to accept the honor of having slain the boar, and gave to Atalanta its head and rough hide as trophies belonging to the victor. His companions were angered that such honor should be given to a mere girl, and they feared the scorn and ridicule that would be heaped upon them when they returned to report the success of the hunt. Meleager, however, did not heed their murmured threats, nor did he listen to the reproaches of his two uncles, Plexippus and Toxeus, who had accompanied him. To see themselves thus rivaled by a boyish girl was too humiliating for the pride of these two princes, and they began to insult Atalanta by chiding her for joining in the sports of men and showing such unmaidenly boldness. Then they attempted to snatch from her the trophies of the hunt, And at this Meleager, who had been incensed at their taunts to Atalanta, turned upon them in a blaze of fury and killed them both with his sword. Meanwhile Althea had heard that the boar was slain and was on her way to the temple with a thank offering, when news was brought that her two brothers had been killed, and by the hand of her son. Then the sister's desire for vengeance crowded out of her heart the mother's love for her son, and she brought out of its place of concealment the brand on whose existence depended Meleager's life. She lit a fire, and then hesitated for a moment whether to commit this dreadful deed or not, but the thought of her murdered brothers hardened her heart, and she threw the brand into the fire. As the flames wrapped around it, Althea fancied that she heard it give a groan, and seized with remorse she was about to snatch it from the fire, but the memory of her dead brothers stayed her hand, and she sat by the fire watching the flames consume the brand. While this was going on, Meleager suddenly felt his body seized with deadly pangs, and, though not knowing the cause, he was certain that his death was at hand. Then, like a brave man and a warrior, he lamented that he must die in this mysterious way, and not meet his death fighting like the heroes of old. He called upon his mother and father, upon his sisters, and upon his loved Atalanta, but no one could save him from his fate. When the last bit of the brand fell into the ashes, Meleager died, and his mother, now filled with horror and remorse at her deed, committed suicide. Atalanta, having won fame and the spoils of a celebrated hunt, was now welcomed at her father's court, and returned there to live. But though she spent much time at the palace, she could not be induced to give up the chase, and roam the forest as before, glorying in her freedom. Her father could not persuade her to marry, although many noble suitors sought her hand, for an oracle had once warned her that marriage would be her ruin. To her father's continued insistence she at last returned this answer, that she would wed the suitor who could beat her in a foot race, but the conditions of the race were to be that the runner, if defeated, should lose his life. Rather than accept these terms, many of the suitors withdrew, but some remained to run the race, for the maiden's beauty was worth a great venture. None of them, however, succeeded in beating the fleet-footed Atalanta, and each man paid the price of defeat with his life. In vain the old king implored his daughter to alter the hard conditions, but Atalanta was determined never to wed. At one of the races a youth named Hippomenes was made a judge, and when he learned the terms of the contest he turned to the competitors and asked them why they were so foolish as to risk their lives for the sake of a maiden's beauty. As he was speaking, Atalanta appeared dressed for the race, and when he looked at her, Hippomenes said, "Pardon me, youths, I knew not the prize you were contending for." When the race was over and the defeated runners put to death, Hippomenes, undaunted by this result, boldly asked that he might try his fate. Atalanta looked at him pityingly, for he was a youth of noble bearing, and she felt a strange reluctance to see him go so blithely to his death. She would not admit to herself that she could fall in love so quickly with a stranger, and yet she half hoped that in this race she would not come first to the goal. As Hippomenes prepared himself for the running, she thought, what unkind god wishes to bring disaster upon this youth, and commands him, at the risk of a life so dear, to seek this marriage. In my own opinion I am not of such great value. It is not his beauty that moves me, though he is good to look upon, but I pity him because he is still a boy. He himself cannot affect my sympathies, but his youth moves me." Then she tried to persuade Hippomenes to give up the race, but the more he looked at Atalanta the more determined he was to win her, and he demanded the right to compete alone with the fleet-footed maiden. Reluctantly Atalanta prepared for the race, and as Hippomenes waited eagerly for the sound of the trumpet, he breathed an ardent prayer to Venus to help him win the peerless maiden. Venus, the patroness of lovers, heard his prayer, and, unseen by any watchers, slipped into his hand 3 golden apples gathered from a wonderful tree on her own island of Cyprus. When the signal was given for the start, each runner shot forward like an arrow from the bow, but Atalanta soon outdistanced her lover, and his fate seemed assured. But just as she passed him, he threw in front of her a golden apple, and the maiden, surprised at this unexpected interruption, stopped to pick it up. Hippomenes pressed eagerly forward, but Atalanta soon overtook him, and as she sped by him he tossed another golden apple in her path. Caught by its glitter, the maiden stooped again, and while she paused to recover the apple, Hippomenes shot ahead. This advantage was soon lost, however, for again Atalanta outran him and was speeding past him toward the goal. Then the lover, with another prayer to Venus, threw the third golden apple; but by this time the maiden had begun to fear that she might be beaten by the handsome stranger, and so hesitated to stop for the tempting golden fruit. Venus impelled her, however, to pause long enough to snatch the apple quickly from the ground, and in that moment's delay Hippomenes passed her and reached the goal. Thus for the first time the race was won by another than Atalanta, and Hippomenes claimed the maiden as his rightful reward. Triumphantly he carried off his prize, and for a long time he and Atalanta were so happy that the words of the oracle seemed unlikely to be fulfilled. But unfortunately the lovers forgot to do honor to Venus, and the goddess was so angered at their ingratitude that she caused them to give offense to Cybele (Rhea) by desecrating her sacred grove. To punish them for this impiety Cybele changed them into a lion and lioness, and yoked them to her car, which they were ever afterwards compelled to draw. Chapter 29